Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel that takes on all sorts of issues related to understanding narcissism, narcissistic abuse, and toxic relationships in general. It's my hope that this understanding will help you in healing, in growing, and even avoiding these relationships in the first place. If you're new to this channel, please join us. Please subscribe. It'd be great to have you join this ever-growing community that's learning more and more about narcissism and really saving their own lives. And if you want to get notifications every time we put out a new video, just hit that notification button and you will be told every day because we put them out every day. That's a lot of narcissism. Today's video relates to something that someone had written in about. Again, we read your emails, we read your questions. I promise you that. And this was actually a really interesting one. It's something that I've seen come up clinically. I've seen it come up in questions and comments. So I'm happy to finally bring this video out there. So I want you to sort of think about a person who has an adolescent child. Adolescence is tough. That adolescent is doing that adolescent-y stuff, which can feel oh so narcissistic. And you, as the parent, get triggered by your adolescent's behavior that feels narcissistic. So let's take that on. So this idea came in as a question by a few people in a few different ways, but the issue brings together a few separate issues. Well, the first is this idea of adolescent narcissism. Now, I've said this repeatedly on this channel, that developmentally, narcissism is a story that can really only be told backwards, but it's not really easy for us to tell it forwards. And what do I mean by that? Narcissistic behavior in general, meaning things like entitlement, emotional dysregulation, anger and rage, especially at parents, spotty empathy, but having lots of empathy for peers, very little for their parents. All of that can look like narcissism in adolescence. Now, we know that adolescents' brains are still developing, though, and that means that adolescents will often, because of this brain development, reach more into their peer relationships and bring their A game with their peers, but far less so with their parents. And until this frontal lobe gets set, we see that impulsivity and dysregulation that also characterizes adolescence. Being difficult is part of adolescence. It's a time of separation and individuation, kids trying to create distance from their parents. And sometimes they create that distance by being just plain awful. Now, somewhere in the mid to late 20s, this frontal lobe has kind of done its thing. It's good to go. And what we hope to see in a healthy person is better behavioral and emotional regulation. That person pops into adulthood. And then we'd like to see that the entitlement kind of evens out. They're not acting so jerky. They're more regulated. They have empathy for people in a more consistent way. And then their parents look back at adolescence and say, whew, I'm glad that that's over. However, there's a not insignificant subset for whom the 20s turn into 30s and 40s and so on, and the entitlement and the rage and the bad behavior all persist. Those are our adult narcissists. Those parents will look back and say, they've actually been like this since their teens or earlier. It's a story that can be told backwards, but not necessarily forwards. So yes, adolescence, I can attest to it, can be difficult, and they can be mean, and they can be demanding and unkind and sullen and rageful and abusive to their parents. Now, where this gets tricky is if the parent themselves has had a history of narcissistic abuse, either with their own partner during adulthood or from their own childhoods. As a result, that parent's adolescence surly behavior, which intellectually a parent knows is a part of adolescence, can still be very triggering because that happens at a deeper trauma level, given their history of narcissistic abuse. And so the adolescent child's behavior can really do a real number on the parent. Many parents with histories of narcissistic abuse really can struggle with their children's adolescence. They want to do right by their children. They don't want their children to experience the nightmare and the mess that they did. But at the same time, the parent might find themselves completely overwhelmed by the triggering that being on the receiving end of an adolescent child's narcissistic behavior can result in. Now, parents with these histories who are in these situations may find themselves having a range of reactions, including the drive to withdraw, become numb, become angrily reactive and shout back themselves, or feel and behave in a victimized manner themselves. Now, many times in these situations, the parent doesn't like their own behavior and struggles with how they're getting sort of triggered and popped off. And the child really struggles with their parents' responses, and then they may push back even more. It can become a really, really unhealthy cycle. Now, first, to any parents who are going through this, I want to really validate your experience. I understand this, child or not. If someone is coming at you with gaslighting, invalidation, rage, dysregulation, devaluation, dismissiveness, criticism, mockery, and this reactivates similar experiences from childhood for you, having strong reactions is actually to be expected and somewhat normal. Whether those reactions are internal, things you feel, or external, the way you speak with them. But it really can feel terrible when it is your child to have such negative thoughts, negative feelings, or even behaviors. And all of this can also keep the toxic cycle in place with your own child, the very child you were saying, I'm protecting them. I'm not going to let the same things happen to them. Therapy for you, particularly addressing core wounds and issues raised by narcissistic abuse, become really important in these cases to understand your history and to be far more self-compassionate with yourself when you do get triggered and activated. Also, to learning mindful techniques and to learn to breathe through the more difficult moments. None of this is easy, and it can feel terrible to have these kinds of reactions and feelings when it is your own child. And sometimes you feel like you can't keep the horses back. Over time, if you end up on the best scenario side of this, your child will grow out of the adolescent angst, entitlement, and rage, and you will end up on a more even keel. But in some cases, that may not happen. And there is the grief around that. And you may have a lifelong struggle with an adult narcissistic child. Only time will tell. But for a person who has had a history of getting narcissistically abused, to run into this invalidation pattern again, but from your own adolescent child, even if you are intellectually able to make sense of it, even if you are able to understand that teens are teens, the triggering, again, which is at that sympathetic trauma processing level, can take a real toll on you. I get it. It is really hard. And in many ways, you react as you might have reacted to a parent, or the way you wish you reacted to a parent, or even a way parent reacts to you. And you vowed you wouldn't do it. So when you do it, you feel absolutely terrible. But when your adolescent child's gaslighting you, it doesn't feel good. Yes, it's communication skills, but I think it's also more important to have that therapeutic space to just sort of let it out, say what you need to say, let that anger out, let those feelings out, so that when you are faced up against it with a child, you can have more measured responses, good boundaries, and then cross your fingers that somewhere around the age of 25, this old part of the brain does what it's finally supposed to do. Thanks again.